Hello. Today we're going to look at Waymaker's new syncing settings that were introduced in version 1.0.4. You might be familiar with how Waymaker synchronizes to your DAW already. By default, Waymaker follows the transport of your DAW. So when you hit play in your DAW, Waymaker comes alive as well. But there's a new option, which, in my opinion, can make Waymaker integrate with your projects and make it a bit more usable in certain contexts. In the case of syncing to your transport, that's great, unless you don't want Waymaker to play all the time. Now, if we go into the settings menu, you'll see that there's a new syncing options section. By default, Waymaker synchronizes to your transport, which is what we were just looking at. But now, Waymaker can synchronize based on MIDI messages. So it's still going to follow your BPM and stay in time with your DAW, but now we can define notes that will start or stop Waymaker. So we can set a start note here, in this case C1, and by default Waymaker will play for as long as this note is held. So I'm in Ableton, so I'm going to create a MIDI clip here, and I'm going to create a C1 which is held for the entirety of the MIDI clip. And so if I just hit play in the DAW, nothing happens. But if I play this clip, then Waymaker comes alive. And so if you're someone who uses scenes in Ableton, this can be pretty handy. For example, I could call this my start scene. And I could say, oh, I want Waymaker to play in this section, and this section. So when we start this scene, we get our sequence. But when we go to the next scene, it stops because our note is no longer held. I should also note that there's a stop behavior here, which defines what happens when Waymaker receives the stop signal. Is it going to stop and reset, or is it going to pause where it was? I think in most cases you probably want it to reset, but you should just be aware of that. Alternatively, we can use an explicit stop note. So let's say our stop note is going to be D1. So whenever Waymaker receives a C1, it'll start playback, and when it receives a D1, it'll stop playback. So maybe we just modify this clip, call it stop, and then change it to a D1. So in this case, Waymaker doesn't care if the C is being held. It will only stop if we send it the stop signal. So both of these ways of kind of synchronizing Waymaker can both be useful. By default, we use that hold behavior because I think that can be nicer in terms of if you were to just stop your transport, you probably want Waymaker to stop as well. So stopping your transport will stop that note and will stop Waymaker. You can also define a CC to control Waymaker as well. So, for example, just to demonstrate, I can control Waymaker with CC1, which is the mod wheel on your keyboard. And if I just move my mod wheel, now I'm triggering Waymaker. But you can do this with any kind of MIDI controller as well. if you have a MIDI controller that lets you map CCs to a knob or to a button or whatever, basically when this control goes over half, Waymaker will start playback. And when it goes down below half, it'll stop playback. So really easy to map that to a knob or something like that. There's one other new way to control Waymaker, which is noted here. Waymaker can be controlled with a parameter. So Waymaker now has a parameter called play. And when that goes above half, Waymaker starts playing. So that can also be mapped to a knob on your keyboard or MIDI controller or whatever. You can also automate that if you want to kind of define sections of your song where you want Waymaker to play or you want it to stop. So you've got a bunch of ways to kind of trigger Waymaker and kind of have it follow along with your DAW in a more robust way. And finally, I just want to note that if you have a particular configuration that you like, you can save that as the default. And that's going to be the default configuration whenever you start a new instance of Waymaker. So if you always want Waymaker to respond to a C1 and you always want it to hold, then you can make that the default. Or if you're doing kind of like live set kind of stuff, you can always map Waymaker to some CC and just have it always come up with that behavior by default. And finally, I just want to note one more thing, one more little gotcha. When you're using MIDI notes to control Waymaker, the first thing to note is that this note is going to be stripped out of the input signal. So for example, if you're using Waymaker as a MIDI processor, if you just want to use it to transpose whatever MIDI you're sending it, it is going to ignore and remove this note from what actually hits this sequencer and gets transposed. So I would generally recommend that you use notes that are kind of outside of the range of what you would use anyway. So you can really go quite low, like maybe a C0 or C-1 or something like that. And the other thing to note is that some DAWs don't agree on what a C0 or what a C1 is. I've tried to make it so Waymaker is kind of, it will use whatever it thinks that DAW considers a C1 or a C0, but there can be some issues where certain DAWs think that, they can't agree on which note is which octave. So some of them will think that a C1 is an octave higher or lower than a different DAW thinks that it is. So I've tried to configure Waymaker to kind of intelligently, map this to what your DAW is going to say is a C0. But if you have issues with that, it might be an off by octave error. If you get that, please let me know, because I will try to patch it into a future version of Waymaker, just as we discover all of these esoteric differences between DAWs. I would be happy to kind of improve them. So that is the new syncing options for Waymaker. And I think that this might be my favorite new feature, just in terms of making it a bit more usable and kind of just make it a bit more responsive. Previously, you kind of had to open the UI and maybe manually hit the play button or the stop button. Now you can just send it a MIDI note and it'll all be perfectly synchronized to whatever's going on in your DAW. So that is the new syncing options that were introduced in version 1.0.4.